Welcome, we're good to go.
Good morning, everyone. If you are tuning in, it's because you know that today is Wise Women Wednesday. Today, our focus is civil rights. I am Burnadette Norris-Weeks, and I am a board member of Roots List Florida. I am also the founder and one of the directors of the Women of Color Empowerment Institute, Inc., which is a sponsor of this forum. Roots List helps progressive women run inspiring local campaigns that win. We identify, recruit, train, mentor, and elect Democratic pro-choice women to all levels of office in Florida. The Women of Color Empowerment Institute, Inc. is a 501c3 organization with a mission to enhance and expand leadership by women of color. Now, the Black Lives Matter protests that have followed the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery remind some of us, or maybe we didn't live it, but we've heard about it, of what it must have been like during the 1960s and the national response to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., combined with the protest of the Vietnam War that plunged and already divided America into deeper turmoil. Now, look at where we are now. We've gotten better than that time, but fast forward to now and consider how this entire nation was recently traumatized by the horror of seeing George Floyd slowly murdered on the ground as he cried out for his dead mother. We will cover some of these topics that are really somewhat related to the vestiges of slavery, not even somewhat, they are related to the vestiges of slavery. And we'll offer some solutions in an era of needing to elevate Black Lives Matter to more than just a hashtag. So thank you for tuning in. For those of you who are on the line on Zoom, Facebook, and other social media platforms, you will hear from phenomenal women discussing a topic that has rightfully risen to every news cycle that's happening right now in these United States. Our Wise Women Wednesday guests today are candidate Michele Rayner and State Representative for District 108, Dotie Joseph or Dotie Joseph, and you will be inspired by these two women who are both Roots List supported candidates. And I'm going to read for you a little bit of the highlights or tell you a little bit about them, each of them. First, Michele Rayner is the founder and principal attorney at the Civil Rights Liberty Law. She focuses on criminal defense and civil rights law. Because of her stellar work on cases that rose to national prominence, including those of Marquez McLaughlin and Yasmin James, and most recently, Barbara Pinckney, Michele has quickly become an emerging voice on the issues of criminal justice reform, education, health, and economic disparities, and race and gender issues, both locally and nationally. She is currently the local counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in her area. She is a former assistant public defender for Hillsborough County and Pinellas, Pasco counties. She was a legislative aide to our beloved Arthenia Joyner, former Florida State Senator. She received her Bachelor's of Science in Political Science and International Affairs from Florida State University, and also her Master's of Science in International Affairs. She is a Florida Coastal Law School graduate and a member of many organizations such as Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, Go Deltas, and has received numerous awards. Now, Dotie Joseph is Haitian born. She grew up in North Miami and attended Miami-Dade public schools. She earned degrees from Yale University, Georgetown University Law Center. She has been a champion for community empowerment and has been an advocate for civil rights and human rights. She has, since being a teenager, her passion has been doing just what she's doing right now. And she's taken that passion to Tallahassee, where she quickly rose as a leader, being someone who has masterfully been able to work across the aisles and getting things done. She has been an advocate for equal access to quality education, affordable healthcare, public safety, and economic development to improve the quality of lives for all who live, work, and play in District 108. She is in one of the most, by the way, diverse districts in the state of Florida. So I can tell you so much more about Dotie, who was a state legislative correspondent for U.S. Representative Peter Deutsch, and she also externed with the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice and has received numerous awards, honors, and recognition. So let's jump right in. You see that you have two very accomplished, amazing women, and I want to start off with a question of how both of you see, and I'll start with Ms. Rayner. And how do you see Black Lives Matter, the movement, compared to the civil rights movement of the 1960s? What do you see right now in terms of this movement?
So I think that we're in a moment, but I think that we have to really look at it at a broader scale. So there is the movement for Black Lives, and the movement for Black Lives is the home for BLM. It's the home for Dream Defenders. It's the home for, Black Youth Power 100 and so many other organizations. So we have these moments that have happened, specifically, I think we can go back to, the murder of Trayvon Martin and all that's bringing us all the way to this point. And so we have these moments where it seems more heightened, right? And the rally cry is, Black Lives Matter. And it's these ebbs and flows. And within even just kind of the ebbs, you are able to see policy and demands getting met. And so for me, it's really interesting because my mom and my dad were very active in the civil rights movement. Actually, my mom and my dad were one of the first handfuls of Black students that ever went to the University of South Florida. So they integrated the University of South Florida. So having the conversations with my parents, kind of with their experience and what we're experiencing now has been amazing. And, I think that there are ebbs, there are similarities, right? However, we're in a different time. And we've been able to make, obviously great gains. So I think for us in this moment, we have to make sure that we're not comfortable. We have to make sure that we're not stagnant. We have to make sure that, the comforts that we have because of technology and all of those things do not keep us in the place of not wanting to push forward. But I know even over here in Pinellas County, because of the protests that have been happening, we've seen that law enforcement has decided to, take money from their budget and put it into mental health services and making sure social workers are able to go out to certain types of calls. So we're seeing that progress is being made. Are we there yet? Absolutely not. But I think that we have to keep still pushing. So once again, the similarity is, within the civil rights movement, when they were protesting and, the bus boycott, for example, they were able to get the demands met, but it was a continuous push. It was a continuous movement. It wasn't just a stop and start. And that's what I think has to happen and has to continue. And in this moment, particularly that we're in.
Very good. Thank you for that response. And the same question to you, Representative Joseph. How does the Black Lives Matter movement compare, in your opinion, to the civil rights movement of the 1960s?
Sure. I'm going to also make a distinction. So the Black Lives Matter movement did not start with the death of George Floyd, right? That's what propelled it to a lot of national and international attention in a way that we had not seen before with the protests. We had protests for years leading up before that, right? With Trayvon Martin, with Freddie Gray, with Philando Castile, with a whole host of other people that sometimes we forget, but I want to say their names too, including Sandra Bland, because women have a role in what's been going on too. It's not just Black men. But with all of that, one distinction that you see between the traditional civil rights movement of 1960s that we think about, right? The one that Ms. Rayner's parents were involved in versus what we see now post George Floyd is the organization structure is different. Before, there were specific people leading the movement, and it was quasi-centralized and coordinated with different groups, whether it's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, groups coming out of certain churches, and a whole host of folks, but there was an informal chain of command. Here, we don't see that. It's completely decentralized to the extent that people want to touch in with some of the Black Lives Matter folks who originally founded it, plus the organization that controls the website, versus those that are in our local communities, you see that there's a different kind of relationship between quote unquote leadership and the people on the ground. A lot of times these movements here in the present day are led by people on the ground in these little communities and bigger communities and all around the world, that are not necessarily clearing anything, getting permission from, or anything like that with quote unquote home base, right? Some of the similarities is, it's the same motivation, right? We want to be treated equally. And it's a shame that we have to keep fighting these same battles, but that's kind of how history works. It repeats itself, and unless we learn our lessons, it will continue to repeat itself. Whether we're talking about how to deal with a pandemic, like when we had the Spanish flu, or whether we're talking about how we incorporate all people of color into our government structures. The more you exclude them, the more we're going to fight to make sure that we're part of the structure, right? Unless we just become complacent. And I want to remind people that, when we think about the civil rights movement, we think about little flashes of things that we either have seen in terms of video footage or in terms of what we read in books. But I'll just give you one example of one movement within the larger civil rights movement of the 1960s was the Montgomery bus boycott. That is not something that took place over, a couple of weeks, a couple of months. It took place over in excess of one entire year. So, when we talk about what these movements look like, even though a lot of this has kind of faded into the background in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and in terms of protests. Sometimes you still see stuff, out in Oregon and places like that. I'm just telling you that they're still happening. They might be getting less camera footage in your news stations, but they're still happening. So these are movements that take place over a period of time. And some of that change happens quickly. Some of it is medium, and some of it just requires sustained effort to basically wear people down to get to the change that we need.
Very good. Now, I want to ask a question about collaborations, and I want you both to think about collaborations. So for instance, the Women of Color Empowerment Institute is collaborating with Ruthless Florida. And while a large number of women of color are supported by Ruthless Florida, pretty much over 40% of the women that Ruthless supports are women of color, sometimes there's an uneasiness or an uncertainty about how we can be allies in this civil rights movement, because it's going to take all of us to get through this period and get through this period where we're all whole, and that means everybody's whole. And so in terms of allies, what advice would both of you give in the way of making sure that we are working collaboratively with organizations such as Ruthless, who are natural allies, want to be allies, want to support, but may not know, individual members may not know how. So give some advice, and I'm going to start with you, Dotie, and then, or State Representative Joseph, and then we'll go to Ms. Rayner.
Sure. I mean, there are lots of ways to be allies, right? A lot of times that allyship plays out in different ways, and there's small ways to be allies, there are big ways to be allies, right? So structurally, one way to be an ally, I've seen this in a couple of different protests, is when the groups get together and the police show up, some of the white allies form literally a human shield around the Black protesters, because they suspect with good reason that the Black protesters will be targeted, right? So in an effort to protect the Black protesters with their whiteness and their privilege, right? And perception with that in the police, they will form a shield. That's an example, right? Another example that's a little bit, more basic that most of us will run into is when somebody says some stupid racist stuff, you just check them. hey, that's not cool, right? That's, why would you say that? And so that's something that we can do in our little day-to-day lives. And sometimes it's having those tough conversations, even within our families, right? Multi-generational things, conversations happen. And sometimes people say things that, are not appropriate. And you see the clips on social media, kids standing up to their, parents with these unfortunate ideas that perpetuate racism, right? So those are some teeny examples. In terms of organizing, that can look different ways, just as any ally. So whether we're talking about making sure that masks and water and hand sanitizer exists at protests, and helping provide those kind of supplies, or when we are looking at more legislative change, for example, showing up in support of those things and calling your representatives in support of those things. The Florida legislature doesn't meet again until after elections, which is going to be the end of this year for committees. But then the actual convening of session is not going to happen until next year, right? So with that in mind, there are other things that can be happening at the local and federal level. And for example, in Miami-Dade County, there has been an effort to have a civilian investigative panel, which passed, but then was vetoed by the Republican mayor, who wanted specific provisions included. So now they have to go back to the drawing board and consider whether or not they're going to include those specific provisions, which water down the impact of that particular legislation. But my point is, that's a way where people can call in, advocate for, put pressure on the mayor to support something that is in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. Another way to do that is to support whether it's candidates who support Black Lives Matter things. So, you have two candidates here, you can contribute to their campaigns. I know that sounds really basic, and sometimes people are afraid to say those kind of things because it sounds kind of self-serving, but I want to put this in context, because people right now are funding campaigns, right? There's no secret that on the other side of the aisle, they are heavily funding campaigns. And as a result, we have policies that show what their values are. So we cannot be on the other side, the more progressive side, and say, well, you can't do this and you can't do that, and not fund our candidates ourselves. So we need to put our money where our mouth is. Separate from that, you can volunteer, right? Even within those smaller Black Lives Matter movements, there's lots of organizations working to put forth change in their communities. For example, in Miami-Dade County, we have Dream Defenders, we have Power You, we have a whole host of organizations, depending on where you fit in that generation scale or how you want to get involved. There are lots of things that you can do to serve as an ally within that movement, just in your day-to-day life, right? Support Black businesses. I mean, so many things that fall within the aegis of Black Lives Matter and how you can be an ally. So I would just encourage people to think, okay, what can I personally do? And if you Google it, I'm sure you're going to find way more examples than what I just identified. But I want us all to know that we all have a part in this movement, right? So whether we're talking about the civil rights movement, there was a place for a Malcolm and there was a place for a Martin, right? Not everybody has to use the same tactics or the same strategies. Some of us are a bit more aggressive than others, and some of us are not. And that's okay. There's room for all of us within that movement. Not everybody's comfortable going out to protest. And that's okay too, because we need to lobby people, whether it's to make sure that Breonna Taylor gets justice, whether it's to make sure that other cases get the attention that they deserve, like Elijah. So my point is, there are lots of ways for us all to get involved, and to think about that, whether it's at an organization level or as an individual level. How can you participate in that movement on a day-to-day?
Thank you, Representative. Same question for you, Ms. Rayner.
So I think that there's so many ways, and Representative Joseph hit on probably the majority of things I was going to say, because I mean, she is so right. There is just tremendous work that can be done. But one of the things I actually was really lucky to do, all of us have a friend in common. She is on the board of Ruthless, and she asked me, she said, hey, listen, I know you're not the teacher of Black America to white women, but I have a group of white women who are horrified and they're starting to wake up. And we just need a safe place. You're one of my dearest friends. Do you mind if you just kind of talk with us? And I said, sure. And, we started off with the foundation that I am not the teacher for anybody, but we had a really honest conversation. And what I challenged them before we even try to walk out the door is to do that self-work, right? It's one thing not to be racist, but it's a whole other thing to be what we call anti-racist. And what does anti-racism look like? And there's a whole book by Ibram Kendi, I think, that you can pick up that will actually begin to really allow you to interrogate those thoughts, interrogate those ideas. Why do I think the way that I think? Why do I act the way that I act? And because and it's not just a process that you're going to just say, okay, great, today I'm anti-racist, guys. Like, we're going to go outside and it's going to be great. And I'm going to, get involved, in whatever movement work. But it's a continual process. It's a continual learning, because you have to remember a lot of stuff are things that you may not even be conscious of. And so that's one of the conversations that we begin to have of what does it look like to be anti-racist? What does it look like to reject that completely? And then we talked about some of the things that, Representative Joseph talked about. What does it mean to stand in a place of support and allyship, and really moving from allyship to comradeship, meaning that you are in this work with us. You're in this work with people of color. You're in this work with Black and brown folks, gay and straight. How do you do that, but then not take over the work, but still be there to uplift? And so I think that it is not only supporting candidates and that align with the way that you think, because you're absolutely right. There are folks on the other side that money is getting poured into their campaigns. I mean, I look at Twitter and there's certain, folks who are serving in the state legislature right now that I'm like, wow, my God, and where they could be fighting the fight to actually make Florida more equitable. They want to come and sue counties where they don't live in because of a mask mandate.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Pandemic.
Go figure.
Right. And so it's, so I think that we have to, we have to look at that. We have to understand that we can, uplift work that other, women are doing. And I think it's really about having that partnership in it. And even if you have to, and I always say to people, like, Representative Joseph said, you don't have to be out at the protest and with your fist up and a megaphone. I'll do that for you. I will. That's my jam. But where can you find the place that you can fit in? What is your capacity? And whatever that capacity looks like, that's what you should do. My partner, for example, she's not going to be at any protest. Love you to death, not going to be any protest. But what does she do when folks from the Dream Defenders say, hey, listen, we really need some flyers, we really need some social media, we really need some digital strategy pushed out? That's her thing. That's what she does. So she'll push that out pro bono for them. But that's how she can contribute to what we're doing in movement work. So what does that look like for you? And what does that look like for our allies? And so that's one thing that I would encourage everyone on this call to do.
Very, very good. And I will give a plug for both of you to be open, and for everybody on the call and everybody who is listening to contribute to these two women, contribute to their campaigns. These are, Ruthless has a very, very stringent process for selection of candidates. And you can best believe that all of everything has been uncovered that would be possibly uncovered. And these are strong women ready to serve, and they need not only your vote, but also your money. So please do contribute to these amazing, amazing women, lawyers, public servants. So the next question, I'll start with Representative Joseph, and I'm going to ask you first for some context for Amendment 4, and then I want you to explain why Amendment 4 is an assault on civil rights, if that's your belief.
Oh my word. Okay. So for those who don't know, let me just set it up to make sure everybody's on the same page. Amendment 4 was a citizen-led initiative that basically said that, you know, once you've paid your time in prison and you're out, once you're out, you can now have your right to vote restored. Okay. It received overwhelming support across party lines, Republicans and Democrats, and that measure passed. Okay. It's a citizen-led initiative. It passed. And that was basically it. So as long as you're not a murderer, et cetera, you're good to go. Okay. Now, one of the things I'm going to break down to you is some of the politics that people play. Okay. Now, citizens passed it, good. We want these folks, once they come out, to these returning citizens to be able to vote. Fine. We get there, the legislature, Republican dominated, decides that we need implementing legislation, right? What they actually put forth is undermining legislation because it completely undermined the will of the voters. So now they went and attached financial obligations to right to vote. So if you have fine, fees, costs, restitution, all of that must be paid prior to your right to vote being restored. That's what they said, right? We in the Democratic caucus fought tooth and nail. Some took the position that, you know, that the legislation is self-executing, and some took the position that it's not. So let me break down one politic that goes into this process. Sometimes they think things are self-executing and they don't do anything extra. We didn't need to do anything extra. Maybe define, you know, what constitutes murder, you know, first degree, second degree, whatever, fine, I'll grant you that. But other than that, we really didn't need to do anything. But they felt the need, they, meaning the Republicans in the legislature, felt the need to interject themselves in that process. Okay, so that's politic number one. Fast forward, we're in the legislature and we're debating this stuff. And their argument is that, well, when they, meaning the people who are putting forth this initiative, went before the Florida Supreme Court to ask for this to be included in the ballot, the Supreme Court engages in a colloquy with these folks that ask certain questions. So one of the questions had to do with, well, would fines, fees, and costs be a part of this? And the short answer of that was yes, right? But for the legal folks in the room, that colloquy was purely dicta. It had no implication on anything. It was not binding on any court, nor was it binding on the Florida legislature. We can decide what we want because we're literally the body that is called on and constitutionally authorized to make laws. So that's one. That's politic number two. Separate from that, even if that's what was said, that's not what the voters understood. And then they tried to say, well, that's what the voters thought that was going on. No, no voter thought that. And I personally knocked on doors in support of Amendment 4. And the message was always, once you get out of jail, you can vote. That was the whole point, right? It had nothing to do with paying everything. Now, so that's, I already told you, that's politic number two. Now, a larger politic has to do with our judicial system and what's going on with, you know, how the conservatives have basically taken over and set it up all the way up to the Supreme Court level. So after all of this happened, it passed because they have the majority, right? And then it goes on to litigation because this is just foolishness. So it becomes litigated, and at the lower court level and the appellate court level, and I'm going to stop short of the Supreme Court, we find that the courts have recognized the issue of this disparate impact on folks because of, you know, their financial ability to pay. And let me put this in a larger context of the United States. In the entire United States, over 24% of the people who cannot vote because of a criminal conviction reside in the state of Florida. That's over a quarter in the entire United States. If that's not an equal protection 14th Amendment violation, I don't know what is. And if we think about the origins of how a lot of these, the history of that disenfranchisement took place, if we're honest about it, it was specifically designed to target Black people to disenfranchise them after they got their right to vote. That was something that Florida explicitly did, and I talked about it on the House floor in the debate. And, you know, sometimes we don't want to touch on these sensitive topics to be polite, but we need to talk about the history, because it makes no sense to start talking about us being equal from a starting point when we're not all starting from the same place. And the same thing goes for policies that have racist backgrounds. You can't just say, well, from this point forward, we're going to do it this particular way. You cannot ignore all of the compounded structural racism and the real palpable impact on people without taking all of that stuff into account. Whether we're talking about poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and a whole host of things that the state of Florida explicitly employed to exclude Black people from the voting process. In the context of Amendment 4, it's not necessarily a racial issue, right? But we know that Black people are overrepresented in the prison population. But if we take out a subgroup of those, for example, sex offenders, it's overrepresented by white people. My point is, this is not necessarily a racial issue, but taking into context the historical underpinnings of things that disenfranchise people based on their right to vote, you cannot ignore that. That being said, I'm just going to layer in the fact that this is a poverty issue. And the reason it disproportionately impacts Black people is because Black people tend to be disproportionately economically disadvantaged compared to the rest of the population. And that's a whole host of other reasons as to why to unpackage that, from everything from redlining policies to not being able to be admitted into colleges until the 1960s, sometimes the 1970s, and a whole host of other things that have, if you take it in the historical context, have impeded Black people's ability to advance financially. And for those people who say, well, that was a long time ago, all we need to do is focus on economic, empowerment. Let me tell y'all something. When Black people just focus on economic empowerment and we succeed, let's say we're talking about Black Wall Street and Tulsa and Rosewood and other places where Black people were able to make those economic advancements, notwithstanding the inordinate racism that comes at them, and they just push through. Guess what? When and this is why it's important to remember our history and learn from it. When disgruntled, poor white people take envy with Black people, bad things happen, like Black Wall Street. And they go and they slash and burn and kill because they want to take the lands, right? I wonder, does that sound familiar? We want what you got, so we're just going to come in and take your land. And then there's nothing that can be done about it. So there needs to be not just economic empowerment, but structural dismantling of racism. Make sure that the laws support the anti-racism that Ms. Rayner was talking about, and that we back it up, right? And this is not something that we can relent, we can just do one time and back off. It's something that we need to constantly pull, because the status quo does not favor equality. The status.
You're absolutely right. And Representative, I'm gonna jump in here really quickly. Everything you're saying is completely on point. And as a result of that, let me ask Ms. Rayner a different question. And you're running for House District 70. And I want to know from your perspective, why is it important to elect legislators who have a broad understanding of civil rights issues?
Well, why is it not? I think that Representative Joseph has, walked us through why it is important that we have folks that have a broad understanding. And I want to have a caveat with that. You don't have to be a lawyer to have a broad understanding. I'm just lucky and blessed that I am a lawyer, and that's the practice that I do. But you don't have to be a lawyer to have a broad understanding of it. But I think that you have to understand, especially in this moment that we're in here in Florida, we have, I had heard someone say this, we have two pandemics. We have a health crisis that's going on, and then we have the pandemic of racism that's been here since the inception of our country, right? And what you're able to see is that COVID has confirmed everything that we all have been talking about, everything that I know that Representative Joseph has been on the floor just railing against, saying, y'all, hello, this is what's happening. COVID has confirmed that. COVID has confirmed the, the disparities with regards to the Black and Brown communities when it comes to access to healthcare. COVID has confirmed how the access to healthcare and healthcare inequality is also intersected with systemic racism. Also, COVID has confirmed when we are out and we're trying to, work and have families and how just even the lack of, income inequality, how all of these things are intersected together. And I think we have to really caution against folks who are like, yes, I just want to run because, I need a title and I can't really speak to the actual complexities of the issues, because we have folks that are like that have not been able to do work in this area, have not done work in these areas, have not pressed forward in these areas, and don't have an understanding of even how things of environmental justice has, have COVID has, impacted what, even in the areas with regard to Black and Brown folks and folks who are, socioeconomically disadvantaged. So I think that it is super important, especially in moments that we find ourselves in right now, that we have folks that are able to understand the impact of legislation that could happen and how that will impact, communities. So District 70 is, so to give y'all a little bit of a kind of a history of it. Well, the cool thing is that my uncle actually was the representative for District 70 when it was District 55 before it got gerrymandered. And it is now the definition of gerrymandering. You have a concentration of the seat, which is South St. Petersburg, Florida, which is in Pinellas. And with that concentration, that is a majority, African-American district. Then you have this sliver that goes down to Manatee County, which also goes into a majority of African-American community, and then also stops right at the top of North Sarasota, which is also a majority African-American community. Then you go a little bit Hillsborough County, which you find, our Latinx brothers and sisters who are in that part of Hillsborough County. So literally, the policies and the legislation that and the legislator that is elected for District 70 has to understand that whatever you vote for, not only are you voting for the entire state of Florida, but you are literally impacting the lives of Black and Brown folks. You're literally impacting the lives of working families. You're literally impacting lives of, we have migrant workers that are, farming in part of Hillsborough County. And if you don't have that understanding, if you don't have that intersectionality, you're going to vote because it sounds good. You're going to vote because, it doesn't sound too bad. I guess that I could, go ahead and agree with this, or you'll be fooled by the politics that, Representative Joseph, I almost called you Senator Joseph, Representative Joseph, that Representative Joseph talked about. And that's why I'm so passionate about my race and my candidacy, because, I think that a lot of us on here, especially the women that Ruthless has endorsed, all of us could be doing a lot of other things. This is not like, oh, I don't have anything else to do. Oh, I don't have any other work.
Let me stay with you on another question. I want
sure.
to, there's a really big issue with respect to private prisons. And currently there's a movie on Netflix. I'd invite everybody to take a look at it. It's called 13th, and it deals with the prison system and its relationship to slavery. And the 13th Amendment of the US Constitution, as you may remember from high school civics, made it unconstitutional for someone to be held as a slave. However, criminals were an exception to this amendment. And in that regard, what happened after the Civil War, a lot of Southern, especially plantation owners, they found that they no longer had this cheap labor in place or free labor in place. And so there had to be something done about that. And at the time, people would get arrested for really minor things, next to nothing, and they would be put in these labor camps, and they'd have to work, and they would still provide that free labor that had been a part of the slavery system. And so that migrated to what we have now with prisons and private prisons in particular. And I want to ask you, Ms. Rayner, why are private prisons so problematic today?
Well, one of the things is that private prisons are problematic because it's literally profiting off the backs of people, who, because of the position that they're in, are not able to walk in their full power. Folks who have been convicted of crimes. And the reason that they're also so powerful is because you have corporations and you have lawmakers who are profiting off of the proliferation of private prisons. You have, and we can even see with here in Florida, the organization ALEC, and I can't even think, it's like, Representative Joseph, do you recall what the ALEC stands for? It's the, I can't think of it, but it's essentially the legislative kind of lobbying body that
American
has not.
Legislative Exchange Council.
Correct. Thank you. So it is literally the lobbying body that not just only targets Florida, but all over the country. And what they do is they get with folks, majority on the conservative side, majority on the other side of the aisle, Republicans, and they, lobby them to push forward,
Model
bills and
legislation,
model
right.
legislation. And that's where you've seen, because of the private prisons, that's how we have stand your ground in the state of Florida. It's because of this model legislation. So when you have people who are willing to be bought, because that's really what it is, in order to push forward this model legislation, then that is why you see that there is power in with regard to, private prisons, or that there are laws that you're like, how did that happen? I always talk about this, Ben Crump and I, we are law partners and we're really good friends. And he and I always say this, for example, Stand Your Ground was a solution that was looking for a problem. There was no problem with the self-defense law as it was on the books. So all of a sudden now we have this law that Stand Your Ground that we didn't need. But this is because of this organization that is literally putting forth this model legislation. And, if we have, the legislature that is predominantly, Republican, that's able to push through these bills, this is where you're seeing that you have, the power. And then private prisons aren't subject to, it's a private entity, it's a business. So it may not be subject to the same laws and accountability as, a state-run prison is subject to as well. And it's problematic because the things that people should have in, a state-run prison, and, they don't have that in a private prison, and it can be denied. And think about someone suing a prison. I get called, Ms. Rayner, I have someone in prison right now, and this is happening. We need to sue them. Well, if they get sued and that person's still there, that's their life, potentially. So it's this vicious cycle, and it really is about making money and profiting off of the backs of poor Black and brown and white folks.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I am going to shift to a different question for you, Representative Joseph. And many of the civil rights issues that have been propelled have been led by people of color, and especially women of color. And so from your perspective, why do you think this is the case?
Well, for one, we're the ones probably the highest impacted, right? So if you think about just the inception of this country and our founding documents, the U.S. Constitution did a couple of things that people either forget, don't know about. But one of the things is it defined Black people as 3/5 of a person. And the reason they did that was that so that the white male slave owners could count that towards their population when they're figuring out representation in Congress, right? But Black people themselves could not vote. So right then and there, we're directly impacted as Black people. Layer on top of the fact that women could not vote, and did not have the franchise at the time. Actually, this year marks the 100-year anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. So Black women stand at the intersection of both of those things. So the reason we tend to be at the forefront of those movements is because we tend to be the ones most directly impacted. And again, the status quo is not going to be changing anything for you. Like, they're fine with the status quo. That's how they set it up. But it's up to us who are not benefiting from the status quo to make that demand. Power yields nothing without a demand. So the reason we tend to be at the forefront of these issues is because we are on the other side of that status quo. And it's precisely because of people who lead these movements that gets us to closer to those ideals of what our founding fathers espoused, but maybe did not live out themselves. And I'll just call that for what it is. You know, when we say our Pledge of Allegiance and freedom, when we're talking about liberty and justice for all, right? Is it really for all? Is it liberty we just talked about private prisons. Is it liberty for all? Is it justice for all? And it takes us, people like us, whether you're a Black woman or not, like, everybody has a role to play. You know, white women had a role to play in the suffrage movement, but they also had a role to play in abolition, whether you're talking about serving as allies along the Underground Railroad, whether you're talking about, I mean, at any point in history, you do these things, not just with yourself, but with allies. So the point is, the reason we tend to be at the forefront is because we tend to be most directly impacted. But this is something that everybody has a role to play in, because at the end of the day, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing.
Well said, bravo. Miss Rayner, if you had a magic wand, what would you do or wish for to change or reform the criminal justice system?
Ooh, if I had a magic wand, one of the things that I am really passionate about is minimum mandatory sentencing. I'm a practicing criminal defense attorney, and I actually had a friend when he donated to me. He said, "Listen, I know this is like a dream world, but can you work on this?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's a dream world, but you know, I'll do what I can." And but what I always go back to, this is like one of the very, very first cases I ever had when I was a baby attorney. In fact, I wasn't even a baby attorney. I was a CLI. I was a certified legal intern. And I was interning at the Duval County Public Defender's Office. And we had a gentleman we were representing. He was a prior convicted felon. And what happened is that on 4th of July, his neighbor, who was an elderly man, had a gun, and he was shooting his gun off and to celebrate 4th of July. And he was shaky. And so my client at that point went and got the gun for him to make sure he doesn't hurt himself or anybody else, went up, put it up in the house, and just forgot about it. I think he ended up having an argument with his partner. And so when law enforcement came and responded, I think someone else called law enforcement, they came and responded. She was like, "Oh, he has a gun in there." So the gun was put up. He didn't touch it or anything of that nature. The neighbor corroborated his story, said, "Yep, that's exactly what happened." And my client said, "Yeah, I just hadn't given it back to him." But because of how the law was written, because he was in possession of it, actual or constructive possession of it, there was a 3-year minimum mandatory sentence that if he went to trial and he was found guilty, that the judge would have to impose. The only person that could have waived that minimum mandatory was the prosecutor. Prosecutor was aware of the facts. Prosecutor knew what the facts were. Prosecutor had witnesses, not just the elderly person, but other witnesses to corroborate that. Folks coming in saying, "Listen, ever since he's been out of prison, he's been a model citizen." All the whole thing. Prosecutor said, "No, I'm not gonna waive the minimum mandatory." So we went to trial, hopefully, maybe to nullify the jury, say, "Listen, if we tell the jury the facts, maybe they'll kind of, because juries are fickle, entities, right?" And in this case, this was my very first trial case, because, the prosecutor did their job to ensure that it was the law, the law, the law. Don't worry about the feelings, the law, the law, the law. My client was found guilty. And the judge looked at myself and my supervising attorney at the time and said, if there is any case law that you can give me, I don't care if it's from another jurisdiction, any other authority that says that I can deviate from this 3-year minimum mandatory sentence, please provide it to me and I'll do what I can. And we couldn't provide him the authority to do that. And the state said, if you do it, we'll appeal. And because it would have been an illegal sentence. And so this man who was simply trying to do a good deed and make sure his neighbor was safe was sentenced to 3 years in Florida State Prison. So to me, that was my very first experience as a criminal defense attorney. And so now, fast forward 8 years later, seeing that and having to work with the prosecutors and hoping that you get people to understand that when you're in circuit court, felony court, judges' hands are tied. The most powerful person in the courtroom is the prosecutor, and the judges don't have discretion. And a lot of judges get frustrated that they don't have that discretion. So if I had a magic wand, that would be one of the issues that I would tackle with, criminal justice reform.
Thank you for that. And I know that's a really big issue that the civil rights organization Color of Change is focused on, really trying to educate people about the enormous power that prosecutors have and prosecutor discretion provides for the criminal justice system. So let's move to Representative Joseph. And as we wrap up, and we're going to give, after this question, both of you an opportunity to just talk for a minute, a little bit about your campaigns, and then we will close following that. And my question for you, Representative Joseph, is what is the greatest civil rights issue that you feel is currently facing Florida and the nation?
Wow. So the greatest civil rights issue, I think, that's currently facing Florida and the nation right now is being subject to basically the failure of the American democracy. So that's a very bold statement. But with the person who's occupying the White House, who's arguably a Russian asset, calling the shots, a lot of the protections that we see that should have taken place are on full display. Whether you're talking about secret police being deployed to places, and I say deployed intentionally, to places like Oregon to violate people's civil rights and things that you do not see on American soil. Whether you're talking about the failure of the processes of the 25th Amendment, or the human failure on the US Senate side to perfect a legal impeachment that's purely political. What you have right now is a nation that is held captive to the will of a few people, partially due to our electoral process, wherein the majority have not decided who is in charge and are now being held captive to someone who is arguably not fighting for the people. And we all are just kind of having to hold on to bear it until and unless we make it through November. And we know that he is pulling in foreign powers to interfere in our elections. We know, within the subset of what we've been talking about, of the civil rights movement, specifically as it relates to Black people, we now have a president who talks about, when we're talking about Charlottesville, we have good people on both sides. He cannot articulate the words, they cannot come out of his mouth, Black Lives Matter. You have a problem. And he, and our inability to check him, is our greatest existential threat to all civil rights in this moment in time. And if we don't figure out a way to deal with that, it will have repercussions that will span centuries in history, in global history, not just American history. So that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. I'll circle back real quick to the question you asked previously about a magic wand and criminal justice reform.
Well, I don't know that we're going to be able to stick that in unless you can put it in your 30-second wrap that you can do right now.
No, go ahead. Oh, 30-second wrap right now. Okay, so I thank everybody for participating with us. And I just encourage us to really recognize that we all have personal responsibility when it comes to ensuring that all our rights are protected. And we need to stand up for each other. So thank you to Ruthless. Thank you to you, Madam Moderator. You did an amazing job. And thank you to my co-panelists. This was fun. And continue to stay engaged with me. My website is dotiejoseph.com. That's D-O-T-I-E Joseph.com. You can learn more about me, contribute online, volunteer, all that good stuff. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dotie Joseph, or to her Haitian friends. And I hear her sometime as she's in the community say Dotie Joseph. So, so thank you, Dotie. That was amazing. And Ms. Rayner, if you will give us 30 seconds of a wrap, and then we'll close it out.
Well, I'm so grateful to Ruthless for this forum, and for, you always pushing the envelope, challenging us to be better, challenging us to go deeper, just in our advocacy and in the women that we elect. And I'm proud to be a woman that has been endorsed by Ruthless. That was definitely like, oh, yay. So I'm really excited to be a part of this Ruthless amazing group of women. Like I said, I'm running for State House District 70. We are, I think Representative Joseph can attest, we're in the fight of our lives because we have so much that's on the line right now in our state and in our community. So please go to www.Michele, it's with one L, for Florida.com, and donate, volunteer, get involved. So thank y'all.
Thank you so much, Michele Rayner. You both have been just amazing panelists. Of course, you know that Ruthless helps progressive women run inspiring local campaigns that win, and we cannot win without your support. So we encourage you to go on the Ruthless website, learn more about the organization and the great things that it's doing throughout the state of Florida. We are supporting up and down the ballot, all throughout the state in different counties, amazing women who are going to hopefully change this state for the better. So please support Ruthless, please give, please become a member. And also we'd like for you to learn more about the Women of Color Empowerment Institute by going to nationalwomenofcolor.com. Again, that is nationalwomenofcolor.com, and you can learn more about that organization and the great work that we're doing. We're so happy to collaborate in this way with two amazing organizations, and we hope that you have a wonderful day and you have benefited from this Wise Women Wednesday produced by Ruthless Florida. Have a great day.
Thank you.